So in this case, it turns out that you could see that the Pareto efficiency here, that's the comparison of the realized payoff with the possible payoff ideal in some ideal sense, it goes towards 1 as this E3 is very small. But if E3 is as large as 1/10, in this example, results are only in the 70% some percent level. This is normalized differently. Now, so I had to study I studied first the basic idea, well, in the case of 2 players, this mathematical stuff, and it worked out. And I talked about that when I was in Catania, and I was also by coincidence when I was in the meeting in Ischia. This was years back. Now here's a discussion about 2 players. You see there, I didn't really say what the election process was. How did this cooperation occur? Well, the way it would be with 2 players, either player would be able to accept the other. But this is like it's like being most cooperative in a prisoner's dilemma situation. Now, the other one then accepted, this is as if one player had first refused to confess to the police, and the other prisoner could somehow know that and decide what he should do. But the situation is going to be repeated in time, however. It makes it not so simple for a prisoner. So one player accepts the other player, and then in 2 players, then the other player is able to select a point on the boundary of the accessible area of cooperation. That's called the Pareto boundary, and he can accept it more or less favorable for himself or more or less favorable for the other, because typically this is a curve that has utilities being shifted from one player to the other player. And so that's how I originally made a mistake. I had the choice that if each player voted to accept the other player at the same time, that these 2 acceptances would be thrown out, and there would have to be another election, if there could be another election. But there would only be a finite probability that there would be, it wouldn't be certain that the players would be given another election, because they would be forced to try to be more practical and allow the process to complete. But later on, the final convention was, and it was found to work very well, if each player votes to accept the other, or it also goes for 3, then that a random process is introduced, and it takes one of those acceptances and makes that the effective one, so that one player accepts the other player. So this is the concept of demand, and this is still player. This is what I discussed before, but now we directly generalize from that to 3 players. Well, before I described that, I gave some. Before I described the three players, I gave the graphs in this write-up. But here it is. What do you do for three players? I maybe should go to the graphs. It is sort of complicated. But here is the analogous thing, since I did speak about it. There was, first numbers A1 and A2 were being defined. But this becomes more complicated with three players because here, for example, player 2, this is this is a later stage of it. If the coalition of player 1 and 3 has formed, then player 2 has some probability of accepting that coalition. Now, this coalition of 1 and 3 means a coalition led by player 1, who's named first. Then this process is directly analogous to what was done with two players. Well, if I go on a little, I get to the area of three players, but I won't completely describe it. Now, the previous formula was for things involving three players where one coalition had already been formed. The coalition 1 had become the leader of the coalition of 1 and 3. So player 2 could accept that, or he could refuse to accept it, and that coalition could accept him as the final leader. Even if 1 had become the leader of player 3 and himself, he can accept that player 2 should be the final leader. But here in the beginning, each player can accept another player. And now here, this is the resulting thing would be A1, F2 would be the probability that player A votes for player 2, or to accept player 2. And then A1, F3 is the other possibility. So these are calculated from these numbers A1, F2. So both of those depend on just 1 and A1, F2. Capital A1, F3. Now these are defined down here. This is analogous. It's directly derived from the idea of, in the case of two players. But this number Q12 is an expected calculation. This game is developed with the players having these parameters all determined. So we go in a sort of circular way. In terms of the behavior of all the other players, what does player one expect to be his payoff if he accepts player 2 and if that acceptance becomes effective? He votes to accept player 2, and in spite of what other votes there might be, player 2 might vote to accept him. But if he votes to accept player 2 and that becomes effective so that player 2 is accepted, that becomes the decision at the first round of voting. And so Q12 is what player 1 expects to be paid, expects to be his profit payoff, his utility benefit in that event, that he has accepted player 2. And then he makes a demand. He chooses that. That's a strategic choice. D1 that will be connected with this possibility. If this Q12 is not large in relation to D1, then the number capital A1, F2 will be very small. And so that will mean that that small a1, f2, that would also be small. That would be a numerator. So this shows some of the details about how the three-player case was derived from a two-player case. And there were rules for elections. The quantities that E4 and E5 are small numbers that are related to the process of elections. I found ultimately that we could use a rule that if two or three different acceptances had been voted for at the first stage of elections, then there could be an overlap. And then the question would be how to deal with it. So I found it was simple ultimately to say that a random choice would be made. How many players had voted to accept some other player? Take all these votes and randomly choose one of them. And that would be the chosen acceptance. And then the game is reduced down to two players. See, one player would be accepted by some other player by taking this accepted. The player accepted cannot avoid it. It's part of the rules that he must accept that, must deal with the situation of becoming the chairman of this committee, becoming the ruler of the assets of the other player. But this is not harmful in an ordinary point of view, ordinary utilitarian viewpoint. But so the E4, there's a number that appears in the formulas that's called E4. Here's a formula for Q12. If you notice, a number E5 appears in this. E4 doesn't. E4 is a small number which is considered to be a probability. And E4 is the probability with which an election process is terminated in case no player has voted. That's at the first stage of elections. If player 3 has not accepted either of player 1 or player 2 as his agent, none of them has voted to accept, then this goes into a feedback. E4 is a small number. That's like tossing an event. With the probability E4, the situation is rejected. The players are told that the game is over and they have no payoff. This is a positive sum game. They're motivated to want to have some of that payoff, so there's some motivation to be sufficiently accepting so that this will become unlikely, the event of the rejection of it all. But there's a second stage where there can also be a rejection. After a coalition is formed, then there's a stage of merging for all players. For all players. And this is done by there are two players under a leader and then one solo player. Either of them can accept the other. But if neither accepts, this is a case where the thing has failed, but they can be given a second chance. But E5 is a number which determines the probability that they're not given a second chance. Just like E4 was the probability of the players, all three players, not given a second chance when no one accepted. Now, what we do, the calculations, we work out equilibria as these numbers E4 and E5 become smaller. And then the players play so that they usually is probably an acceptance, but not always. And they're seeking to get the